Hello, everyone. Pastor George here with today's Bible study recap. And today in Bible study, we looked at the ending of the book of Job, specifically chapters 38 through 41, mostly. And that is God's response to Job. So on Sunday, I began with the opening of the book. And the opening of the book sets up the story that's going to follow through. And really, it sets up the debate that takes up the book of Job, right? Why did this happen? How could God allow this injustice, right? Job is a righteous guy. He suffers all this evil. Why is that happening? Job's friends insist that it's because he had sinned. He must have done something. That's why this happened. And then, of course, Job is insisting he's not. And that's the majority of the book of Job, is that fierce debate. At the end of the book of Job, though, God speaks. And God speaks out of the whirlwind, which is a divine image. That God is powerful, in control of things that people cannot understand. Nature being one of them. And what he does, and the best way to think about this is he does a cosmic tour. So in the language and in the ways that Job would understand for his time and his day, God goes through all of creation and asks Job what he knows about it. And so he starts off at the very beginning, right? In the creation of the heavens and the earth. What starts there, right? What is Job's role in this? God is very sarcastic in this section. It's interesting, right? Because we're told that God cares for those who are brokenhearted, that he does understand our pain and suffering, but at the same time, God also here is willing to call Job out. He's willing to say, hey, the way that you've been speaking about me, the way that you've kind of put yourself in a position to judge me is wrong. I am the creator. I'm the one who judges. And so what he does is he asks Job to see if he could be in his position. So he starts with the creation of day and night. He talks about how he knows everything about this. He has unlimited knowledge. He then moves on to the weather. Asks Job how the weather works. Again, this is all sarcastic and with the understanding that Job doesn't know the answer to these things. And then he then goes on to question Job's power. Right? How much can you do? Can you provide for nature? Can you provide for the animal kingdom? I think it's so interesting to think about this. This is what I would call a deep teaching. And what that means is that this is not necessarily things that are easy for people who have just come to the faith to understand, or who are dealing with difficulty. It is hard for them to understand these verses, and that's why it's at the end of the book of Job. Job is a book about mourning a lot, and it's important that this happens near the end. It's a long journey of wrestling, and then you get the answer. And the answer, of course, is not a why answer. That's kind of the one thing that it lacks, is it doesn't give us the why this happens. We as the readers can understand somewhat. Of course, we don't not understand the greater plan of the why, but that's not the point of what God is saying, right? Is he's ultimately critiquing our ability or our understanding of the universe versus his, and that we shouldn't be so quick to put ourselves in a place where we can judge him. And this is something that happens so often in our world, especially if you talk with people who are skeptical, and maybe yourself when you've gone through these times, right, that you end up judging God and saying, like, how could you allow this to happen, putting yourself in his place and thinking that you know more about creation than everything. It's kind of like the movie Bruce Almighty, which I know lots of people have seen. Right, the idea there is that you think it's easy to be God until you're in God's shoes. I'm not saying that movie is particularly theologically accurate, but you get what I'm saying. And so what happens then is Job responds, and Job is humble in his response. And this just shows Job's character, that Job has had this character for so much of the book, right? Yes, he's maybe rushed in to judge God too quickly, but he cares about what God has to say, right? It's not as though he's shouting to thin air. he does want God's response, and he gets it. And in the face of that, he does what anyone would do when confronted by the power and majesty of God, and he admits that God is right. And I believe that's the case for anyone. You could get the most hardened skeptic in the world, and if they came face to face with the living God, they would answer the way that Job does. Often it is times when we are not face to face with him, much like maybe talking smack about, Muhammad Ali, saying, "Oh, I could beat him up." And then he walks in the door, obviously in his prime, not when he's an old man and or he's dead already, but you get what I'm saying. You go, never mind, I'm not going to really fight him. Right? There's a difference between thinking you can do something when someone isn't in the room, you think they're not in the room, and when they are. Right? Things change. So, what is God's purpose in doing this? Right? He again, of course, he goes back to challenging Job again, and this is the part where he talks a lot about administering justice. But what is his purpose in this? Right? His purpose is to show his power and to reveal Job's own ignorance. We do not receive a reason, and if you continue to look through the book of Job, which I hope that you do, you'll get to the end, and this is the really important part, is that Job again admits his humility, and God, in response to all of this, right, he doesn't get mad at Job. Instead, he lifts him back up, and he uses him as an example of what you're supposed to do. He condemns his friends and what they've been saying. He tells them to offer sacrifices, and then he restores Job's fortunes, especially with his wealth, although he never recovers the same amount of children. So it's not as though that those deaths are easily replaceable or mean nothing. I think that's also something that's kind of important here. Like, his children aren't restored, and it's not saying that God can't do that, but maybe it speaks to the permanence of these sad and evil things that happen in our lives, right? The symptoms of living in a sinful and broken world. And so this is ultimately a call for us to remember that God cares about us when we suffer, but that we also need to have humility when we approach the throne, right? That we wish that God's will is done and not our own, because we do not have his mind or his scope of knowledge. So that's what we talked about today. I hope you found that interesting and helpful in your own life as we all deal with suffering and difficulty. I will see you guys tomorrow for an episode of The New Thing. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. Peace out.